Good afternoon. My name is Alan Journet. I'd like to welcome you to the 350 Day Shoots virtual symposium conference on Go Clean Energy. My task is to introduce you to a concept that I'm calling the Oregon Climate Challenge. So let's start out with a little discussion of the topic for today, why we need an everything strategy and Governor Brown's Executive Order 2004. Before we get into that, I'd like to explore a little about the climate models. One of the things that you probably have heard about are the projections that take us up to 2100. These projections are based on the climate models, or what is used in the climate models are representative concentration pathways. There are 4 of them that are commonly used. The first is the 2.6, RCP 2.6, which is a very low level emissions, which really assumes that we stop emitting right away. And as you can see on the graph, that level of emissions taking us to 2100 would give us a rise in temperature of about 1 degree from where we were towards the end of the last century. And that would gradually, over a period of time, probably reduce to historical conditions. At the other extreme is the RCP 8.5, the rapid increase in emissions scenario. This was first designated the worst case scenario because it was thought we weren't going to be on that one. Unfortunately, what we find is we're actually following that trajectory, and so it's become called the business as usual scenario. Between those two extremes, future extremes, there are a couple of intermediate values, RCP 4.5 and 6, depending based on relative degrees of correcting that appalling emissions trajectory that's essential to RCP 8.5. This chart takes us beyond 2100, now up to 2300. What you'll notice is where there's a break there at 2100. And the reason for that break is because the number of models that were used up to 2100 is different from the number of models used after 2100. So there's a slight hiccup as the average of the models changes from the first set to the second set. What you can see is the degrees centigrade increase, and I'll give you that in Fahrenheit. What we're looking at is potentially by 2300 a temperature increase that, if we continue with that business as usual scenario, 14.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's an increase beyond the temperature of the late 20th century. It's relative to 1986 to 2005, in fact. What we can see is it could be even above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The point that is worth making is if we go to the extreme, that's unmanageable. That means there's no way we could deal with that kind of a temperature increase. The other extreme, the RCP 2.5 scenario, is what's called unavoidable. That means there's nothing we can do to avoid that particular trajectory. So the question is, why is that such an alarming trend? And that takes me to where I was for 30 years, teaching biology at Southeast Missouri State University, and particularly teaching a course in ecology, and the segment of the course dealt with the distribution of biomes or natural systems across the planet. And what I'm going to do is share with you my modifications to a graph that was developed by Robert Whittaker, published in his book back in 1975. What we're going to do is look at 2 variables, temperature and precipitation, and you'll see right away these are the critical 2 climatic variables that we're concerned about in relation to climate. When we look at the distribution of these biomes across the planet, they all fit in the bottom left-hand corner of the triangle. Conditions up here just don't exist. This gives you a sense of what the basic climatic conditions are as we go down the edge of the triangle from Arctic, Alpine down to tropical. And when we put into that triangle the three edges, three corners, what we can see is tundra, tropical rainforest, and hot desert as the extreme conditions. But all the way up the left-hand side, there is desert, because that's where precipitation is so low. Bend enjoys an average temperature and an average precipitation as listed there. So let me take you to Bend, or bring you to Bend, I should say. So we put Bend into the chart right here. And what we find is the surrounding vegetation is predominantly a woodland, shrubland, or grassland community. And I'll indicate that just in a second once we finish this brief discussion. Now we can put the rest of the biomes onto that chart, and we can see exactly where they fit in relation to those two axes. Now, the point of this is, if you tell me what the precipitation and temperature are anywhere on the planet, we can go to this chart and we can find out what particular biome is the natural biome existing there. Can't tell you what the species are going to be, because species, for example, in the tropical rainforests of Northern Australia, Indonesia, Africa, Central America, South America, the species are different, but the basic structure of the biome is going to be the same. Now, the key is what happens if we adjust the variables, as we were discussing a moment ago with temperature. One thing we can vary is precipitation. So if we shift the precipitation trend in Bend from where it is to a slightly higher level of precipitation, what you can see is we're heading towards the temperate coniferous forest, temperate deciduous forest kind of a climate. If we go the other way, we're pretty solidly into a cool desert. On the other hand, if we increase the temperature, we're shifting the Bend conditions towards a hot desert. And clearly, if we go the other way, we're shifting conditions very much towards a cold desert. So the key idea here is, if we shift climatic conditions, what we're doing is creating conditions that potentially do not support the biomes that are present there currently. Now, for those individuals who actually don't care about the distribution of biodiversity across the planet, don't care about biomes, the point I'd like to make is these two variables are actually the same two variables that determine, firstly, our agriculture and our fisheries, and secondly, of course, our forestry. As you can see, many of these biomes are forest biomes. This chart comes from a discussion of the ecoregions of Oregon, and you can see the Bend area to the north, northeast, we're getting sagebrush grassland, and to the west, south, and southwest, a ponderosa pine woodland. So what are the greenhouse gases that are driving the climate change that we were seeing in the first models? Well, the first one, with which most people are familiar, is carbon dioxide. Has a longevity in the atmosphere of centuries to millennia, and it has a 100-year global warming potential of 1. Global warming potential is a measure of the relative heating capacity of gases, always compared to carbon dioxide. So what we're going to do is look at the global warming potential of other gases in comparison to carbon dioxide in just a moment. This is also known as the carbon dioxide equivalent. It's exactly the same concept. Excuse me. Let's look at methane. What we can see with methane is it has a 100-year global warming potential of 34 and a 20-year global warming potential of 86. That means methane is much more powerful as a warming agent than is carbon dioxide. And the reason it has two values is because its longevity in the atmosphere is only a decade. Coming down here, we find nitrous oxide, which has longevity of about a century, and that has a GWP of 298. And then over here we've got to recognize water vapor is a warming gas, but it only lives in the atmosphere for about 10 days. So water vapor is largely a consequence of global warming. The warmer it is, the more water vapor there is in the atmosphere because of evaporation. The other set of powerful greenhouse gas agents are the chlorofluorocarbons and the hydrochlorofluorocarbons, specifically human-made gases. And they have a longevity extending from decades to centuries and a very high global warming potential. So these are the gases we really need to focus on when we're thinking of how to address global warming. The question is, what is it we do that causes global warming on a global basis? These are the four activities in which we engage that are responsible for the problem. You can see the big winners are electricity and heat generation, agriculture, forestry, and land use, industry, and transportation. They account globally for 84% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Let's bring it on home a little to Oregon and look at the regulated greenhouse gas emissions from Oregon per sector as a percentage of the 64 million metric tons that are emitted of carbon dioxide equivalent in Oregon. And we can see the three big winners in Oregon are transportation, the generation of electricity, and natural gas. A lot of folks think that electrical generation in Oregon is all hydroelectric. Well, it's not. Much of it is from coal-fired power plants that are outside of the state. So those four account for 78% of the emissions from Oregon. Now, if we come a little closer to home to where I live, what we find is the three major activities in which we engage that result in greenhouse gas emissions are stuff we buy, transportation, and the energy that's produced to supply our home and business needs. The stuff we buy means consumption. So when we buy a TV made in China, for example, the emissions resulting from the manufacture of that TV and the shipment of that TV to us are charged against us. This discussion, I would hope, would help us see what it is that we can do to reduce our individual contribution to the problem and what we should do collectively when we're looking at regulations to address greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see from the Rogue Valley, those three activities account for 100% of the emissions. So what should our targets be? According to the 2015 Paris Agreement, we should be trying to reduce our emissions to less than 2 degrees centigrade or 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit above the pre-industrial level. That they said better 1.5 degrees or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. More recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 says, after looking at the impacts of a 2 degrees centigrade warming, they said we must stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And the same IPCC a couple of years earlier said that 1.5 degrees centigrade increase represents 340 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But, and here's a bit of a wrinkle, if we look at the emissions of greenhouse gases from 1700 up until the present, what we can see here is that we're at about 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That's the light blue line. But, and here's the key wrinkle here, if we look at the total amount of carbon dioxide equivalent gases in the atmosphere, we're up at 500 parts per million. What's really interesting is if we do the calculation that the 90 parts per million between carbon dioxide and all of the gases is about 41% of the warming that we have seen since the Industrial Revolution. What this is telling us is we absolutely have to pay attention to all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon. Focus on carbon is adequate. We must target all greenhouse gas emissions. And not only is reducing emissions in one sector inadequate, even if it's the most profound emissions sector, even reducing emissions across all sectors is inadequate. So we actually have to capture and store, otherwise known as sequester, greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, through photosynthesis from the atmosphere. Hence, we need an everything strategy. We have to do all we can to reduce emissions across all sectors and capture and store greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So let's now turn to what's happening in Oregon, the Oregon Challenge. Let's look at a brief history of time. In 2007, House Bill 3543 was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. That dealt with regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and this, I should stress, is the regulated greenhouse gases, those greenhouse gases that are being measured by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. What that proposal did was target a reduction by 2020 to 10% below 1990 levels, and by 2050 to 75% below 1990 levels. The problem was that was purely voluntary, and we know how purely voluntary goals like this work. They don't, and we'll see that in just a minute. That proposal, that bill, actually also established the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute at OSU. Between 2015 and 2018, when it became very clear that the 2007 proposal wasn't effective, we had a whole bunch of proposals that were formulated and presented to the legislature, but they were all stalled at various stages in the legislative sausage-making machine. Then in 2019, we had HB 2020, and 2020, we had Senate Bill 1530. Come back to those in just a second. This chart now illustrates the problem. What we can see here are, on the vertical axis, are the million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from the state of Oregon. And you can see the relative contribution of each of these activities. Electrical use, you can see, has a major contribution, but unfortunately, I don't know why, but they call it electricity use, but it should be electricity production, because using the electricity doesn't cause a problem. It's the generation of the electricity that's the problem. Transportation, residential, commercial activities that don't involve electricity, industrial and agriculture likewise that are non-electric or transportation. And what we can see is from 1990 through about 2017, we went up and down. The Great Recession hit Oregon, and it resulted in some greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And you can see by 2017, we're at about 65 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Now, as we go forward on the dashed red line, what we can see is what the future looks like if we keep doing what we're doing. But what you'll notice is a sudden hiccup right about here in 2030. And the observant viewer will say, what on earth is that about? Well, that's about the Senate Bill 1547, 2016, called a clean bill, which states that by 2030, electricity used in Oregon must not be produced by coal-fired power plants. And so what you can see is the electricity production takes a big hit in 2030, and all the others pretty much continue as they were. So that reduction is entirely a function of the coal to clean energy legislation of 2016. Now, my guess is that rather than model a gradual reduction in those emissions, what this model has done is assumed that reduction happens very suddenly about 2030. Now, here's the key. If we continue doing what we're doing, we follow on that red dashed line, compare that with the yellow line, which is the pathway that was established by 2007's Bill 3543. What you can see is the vast excess of emissions above our goal that we would be producing by 2050. In 2019, I mentioned House Bill 2020, which was a cap, trade, and invest bill. That was thwarted by a Republican walkout from the Senate. And then in 2020, Senate Bill 1530, a cap, trade, and invest bill, was thwarted by a Republican walkout from both the Senate and the House. So what's been happening is, unfortunately, Republicans have been blocking any effort to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. That 2020 walkout didn't just stymie 1530, there were 100 plus other legislative proposals before the legislature that did a whole array of things which were valuable for Oregonians that were all thwarted by that same legislation. As a result of the governor having committed to climate action in 2020 and the Republicans walking out of the chambers, what the governor was pretty much forced to do was use her executive authority to issue an Executive Order 2004. And that's what we're going to talk about now. The governor's Executive Order 2004, charged Oregon agencies that are relevant to engage in activities that reduced emissions. I confess, when I heard that this was going to be 16 agencies, I thought that must be most of the agencies in the state. Well, it turns out it's about 12% because there are 124 agencies and commissions and so forth in the state of Oregon. And that brings us to Executive Order 2004, which has been dubbed the Oregon Climate Action Plan. So let's have a quick look at that. The goals for the Oregon Climate Action Plan are a little more stringent than the 2007 legislation. In particular, the goal is 45% below 1990 level by 2035 and 80% below 1990 level by 2050. Now, reality tells us, best science tells us, we really need to be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And it is unfortunate that this legislation, this proposal, does not do that. However, what it does do, which is really valuable, is put us on a steep downward trajectory. And we know we need to be on a steep downward trajectory. It appears that the public will is not quite there yet for us to do what we need to do. Our hope is that by starting us off on that trajectory, when the public will is there, we can tweak that to get us on a net zero emissions trajectory by 2050. What this does is instruct state agencies, those I've listed, to exercise their authority and discretion to further achievement of the goals in a cost-effective manner and by prioritizing actions that help vulnerable populations and impacted communities. There's a strong component of social justice in the governor's executive order. The agencies were required to develop proposals by May 15th, and so the process is underway with the relevant agencies. There's also an interagency working group on climate impacts to impacted communities. Now, it's worth thinking about what the main differences are between the legislation and the governor's proposal. The legislation from 2019 and 2020 generated funds by licensing large emitters to pollute. They had to obtain allowances through an auction, which would probably have started at about $15 per ton of emissions. Funds generated would have been allocated to assist economically disadvantaged communities. That means rural and coastal Oregon, like Deschutes County, like Jackson County where I live, like the coast. It also provided funds for communities impacted either by climate change or the transition to a clean energy economy. So it provided funds to address the issues of social justice or social injustice. The executive order is limited in these areas because the governor cannot raise funds unilaterally. She doesn't have the authority. Thus, the investments in rural and coastal Oregon are not possible. It's going to take a lot of thinking about how to compensate for that loss in the executive order. And it sort of makes a good point to illustrate that when the Republicans walked out, as they did in the last two sessions, they actually undermined the capacity for the legislature to provide funds for their constituents. The focus is on redressing social injustice issues. It becomes more difficult now because of the lack of funds. However, the executive order does contain an emphasis on the need to reduce emissions in a socially just manner and charges agencies to develop proposals that would allow lower emissions within their purview. And so that brings us to the statewide Oregon Climate Action Plan Coalition. This has been set up. There are 7 tables or teams addressing each of these areas, and the first one there should be CAP, not CAPE and reduce. It's CAP and reduce, transportation, construction, building codes and appliance efficiency, clean energy, Public Utilities Commission, natural and working lands, public health, and the environmental justice and impacted communities component. Now, if anybody here is interested in getting involved in one of these areas, what you should do is contact Diane Hodiak. There is her email address, and I'll remind you of this at the end of the program in just a few short minutes. This chart gives us an image of what the basic structure is of the statewide coalition. And there is added on the end, those are the 6 content areas, if you like, and on the end there's another, as you heard a moment ago, another section which deals with the climate justice issues. As we emerge from COVID-19, it's very important that we have an everything strategy, not only an everything strategy in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and addressing all the sectors, but also addressing the climate crisis. We must promote by greenhouse gas emissions reductions and sequestration, while we simultaneously acknowledge the need to address social injustice and recognize the 17 United Nations sustainability goals. For example, these are the 17 goals, and we can readily see, I would imagine, that if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we are trying to impose some kind of a mechanism on individuals that are suffering from poverty and hunger, for example, we've got to address those problems simultaneously, because it's not going to be easy for somebody who is suffering poverty or hunger to recognize that there's this overarching problem called climate change. What they're going to be doing is focusing on their poverty and their hunger. We have to address all of these sustainability goals concurrently. Addressing climate change is an everything strategy. The Governor's Executive Order 2004 in Oregon attempts to do that for our state. As you work your way through the rest of this conference, you'll be hearing much more about different sectors within the purview of the executive order. Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it. And I think I'm ready for questions, but we'll let Bill go next and talk about his contribution to this segment. And there's Diane's email address. Thank you very much.